Hey, thanks everyone for watching. Anthony Lewis has joined me once again. Um,
Morning.
yeah, thanks. So this time it's yet another episode of the An Astrologer's Diary, which I kind of meant to do for quite a while, but I've not been able to do. But I'm just catching up with it. Last time it was Sharon Knight, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And this time it's going to be Anthony Lewis. I don't think anyone needs introduction. Like, I mean, I don't think Anthony needs an introduction, and um, you're already well known to most of the people through your books like Horary Astrology and Tarot, and also some of your social media connects, and and uh, from the point of view of those who are watching this particular channel, I think you've already been here at least 20% of what I've done. So
We've done several videos together.
yes, yeah, we have done at least 15 so by now. So uh, yeah, so finally I'm very glad that I got a chance to do this, and I think we have been thinking of doing this for quite a while, and finally we are now sitting here to do this. So thanks so much for joining, and yeah, let's begin.
Sure.
uh, so I think I don't have your birth. I think it's September 3rd of 1945.
That's
So
correct. Yeah.
I don't expect you to remember the way you were born, and I mean the conditions around which you were born. But still, I think what was your you know earliest memory as far as you can date, and let's start from wherever you can start, and then I mean, let's gradually move on from childhood to then adulthood
Sure.
and so on.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I don't remember being born, but I
like
was
every one of
born
us.
in September of 1945. And historically, that was right after the end of World War II.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm kind of one of the baby boomers, they call us. I was born just after the war. And I guess I have some very early memories of the place where we lived when I was a little boy, and we moved to a different house when I was about 5 years old. I remember that. But nothing dramatic.
Okay, cool. So I think I mean, schooling and stuff, everything was okay. So let's begin with astrology, because I think you started astrology very early in your life, so which might have kindled a lot more interest, especially when you got bitten by the bug so early in your life. So let's just talk about when it all
Sure.
happened and how you kind of capitalized on it and saw like astrology as an actual thing to pursue, even though you had a regular field of study and also a regular field of work. So let's just keep all those for a later time. I mean, in this video itself, but still, let's talk about the early stuff at this point of time.
Sure. I don't remember how I first learned about astrology, but I was fairly young. I remember seeing a movie when I was young, like young being like 8, 9, 10 years old. I don't remember the name of the movie. It was one of these comedies. But what the scene I remember that struck me was that I think it was probably some sort of romantic comedy, because there was a hero and a heroine, but there was this old woman that they connected with somehow. And she would, in this movie, she would go outside at night and look at the sky and then tell these people, I saw Venus doing this or Mars doing this, and be careful here. And then what she said would happen in the movie.
Oh.
So I wish I could remember what the movie was, but I still remember the scene where she's out looking at the stars, and it's this beautiful scene of the night sky, and then she somehow knows what the stars are saying and tells the characters what's going to happen. And I thought, that's neat. I wish I could do that. but that's my very earliest memory. And I say probably was like 8, 9, 10 years old.
Okay.
Maybe somebody who's watching has seen this movie. So this would have been mid 1950s or maybe late 1950s if I was older. And then I had an experience. I mean, there was always in the newspaper, the astrology column, your sun sign, and would give a little blurb. I was aware of that, and I never paid that much attention to it. It seemed kind of silly to me. It was very vague and general. But I knew there was astrology in the newspapers, and every day there'd be a column like, today for Virgo, this will happen, etc. But that didn't impress me that much.
Okay.
And then when I was about 11 years old, I remember I had 3 brothers, and my father took us to an amusement park. And in this park, they had rides, typical rides, but there was this little machine that you put in a nickel or a dime, and it gave you a scroll with your birth sign horoscope. And my father bought it for himself.
Oh, okay.
And on the way home, I read this scroll, and it really described my father, I thought, very accurately.
Oh.
So first I thought he was playing a joke on me, that he somehow printed this up and it described him very accurately just to trick me. But then I realized this was a copyrighted thing and he didn't write it. And I couldn't understand how this scroll from a machine could know so much about him that was accurate. And so that got me even more curious. And I went to the library and looked for books on astrology. And in those days, there was very little available. This would have been mid 1950s. Excuse me.
Okay.
But what I found was there were a couple books by Evangeline Adams, and they were back from the 1930s.
Uh-huh.
And there were a couple other books, which I think were popular at the time on astrology. So I read those, and that's how the interest began. And so I was always interested in the sciences as well.
Okay.
And I really liked astronomy. So at some point when I was young, like 12, 13, 14, as a birthday present, I got a telescope for children. And I used to go out and at night and look at the sky with this telescope. And so that wasn't astrological, that was really astronomical. And it was really quite striking even though there was a toy company called the Gilbert Company that made these things. It was a decent, but inexpensive telescope for children.
Okay.
And looking at the moon was quite impressive. And the planet that impressed me the most was Saturn. I remember the first time I saw Saturn, and you could see the rings, and it was so clear and sharp. It was really breathtaking. It was just...
Okay.
So maybe I was 12, 13. I saw Saturn in the telescope. And I was just amazed. It was just... and it was interesting because Saturn I always found very easy to spot in the sky. It was always sharp and clear.
Okay.
But later when I read astrology books, they said it was sort of very dim and not very bright. And I couldn't understand that because to me, you would look up and it was there like shining really intensely. So, but anyway, I still remember seeing Saturn for the first time and just being struck by the beauty of the rings and how sharp and clear it was.
Okay.
And so Saturn has never had a negative connotation for me because I had a really good experience with it the first time I saw it.
Okay.
Well, it's considered a malefic in astrology.
Sure.
And so I was fairly good at mathematics and science, and I used that as I began to study astrology in my teens. What interested me most was the ability to predict. And what I mean by that is that if you read the newspapers, you'd get this very general thing, and it could apply to anybody for a horoscope, for a sun sign. But what impressed me the most was being able to make a prediction, either in science or in astrology, to follow the scientific method, basically.
Sure.
Have a hypothesis, make a prediction, and if what you say happens based on your theory happens, then probably your theory has some validity to it.
Sure.
And so what I began doing, I'd say in my mid to late teens, when I learned how to cast, we used to do it by hand in those days. We didn't have computers yet.
Oh, so great. You learned to draw a horoscope with hand by doing manual calculations in your
I
teens.
got hold of instructions on using the longitude and latitude, how to calculate the midheaven degree. And then there were tables of houses where you could look up the cusps if you use house systems like Placidus. But it was fairly straightforward spherical geometry or trigonometric geometry to calculate the midheaven. And I had a table of logarithms that I knew how to use. And so, you'd use sines and cosines and logarithms to do the calculations, and you'd come up with the midheaven. And once you knew that, it was fairly easy to do the rest of the houses. And once you knew the midheaven and the latitude, you knew the ascendant. And we didn't have computers, so that to find planetary positions, what we did in those days was probably a little less precise than the computer. You would look in the ephemeris on 2 dates, and if you'd find the number of hours since the previous date that the planet had advanced, and you'd do a simple arithmetic proportion. So you'd have close but not exact planetary positions.
Okay.
In any case. And using that, I started giving written predictions to family members and friends.
Oh.
And I did it in writing because I didn't want bias, and then several months later, I would check with them and say, did any of this happen? And if it did, I would be impressed, and I'd note that. And if it didn't, I'd try to figure out why it didn't from the astrology theory.
Okay.
And sometimes it was right on target, and sometimes it was wrong.
Okay.
And the other thing I did was I tried to do with my own chart. And now the problem with my own chart, I didn't know my exact time of birth. And it wasn't on my birth certificate. But I knew from the story in my family approximately what time I was born.
Okay.
And so I found this book that told you how to rectify a chart. So I rectified my chart, and I used the rectified chart. I still am not certain what time I was born, so I used the rectified chart. And the method of rectification, one of the methods of rectification, this book was, my mother had died when I was 8 years old. She had a heart problem, and she died of it. And so, interestingly, the book that I was reading said, if there was a parental death in childhood, to rectify the chart, you would place Saturn, the position of Saturn in right ascension, the number of degrees from the ascendant that corresponded to the age, your age when the parent died. And so I knew from the story in my family, I was born on a Monday morning.
Okay.
And well, here's the story.
Okay.
I was born on a national holiday in the United States, Labor Day. In the United States, it's the first Monday in September. And when I got into astrology, my mother had already died, so I couldn't ask her. And my father's recollection was that he had promised a friend to help him paint his house on that holiday, partly because he needed extra money because he was about to have a new baby, me.
Oh,
And my mother had gone into labor late Sunday night. So he brought her to the hospital. And in those days, I guess the husband didn't stay with the wife. Nowadays, it's changed. So she was in the hospital, and he made an arrangement with the hospital staff. I'll be painting at my friend's house Monday morning. So call me as soon as you think there's going to be a delivery, and I'll come.
okay.
So he went first thing Monday morning. I'm sure they got started early because they had the one day, because he would have been back to work on Tuesday. And shortly after they started painting, the hospital called and he went up to the hospital. I was born. And so it was in the morning, clearly after sunrise. My guess was 8, 9, 10 o'clock, in that range, between 8 and 10 o'clock. So I looked at that period, and sure enough, Saturn was near the top of the chart between 8 and 10 o'clock. And so I adjusted the midheaven in right ascension to be 8 degrees away from Saturn.
Oh, okay. Corresponding to the age. Yeah, okay.
Of course, on my it was the week before my 8th birthday. So I used the 8 degrees in right ascension from the midheaven, from Saturn, to get the midheaven. And that gave me a time of 9:04 in the morning, which fit the story.
Okay.
And what's interesting, and so that's the chart that I used throughout my adolescence into my 20s. What's interesting is in my 20s, my father had remarried, and my father and stepmother were moving and asked me to help them clean out their attic. And in this box in the attic, I found a little notebook where he had written my name, the date, and 9:05. So I assumed the 9:05 was the time I was born. It could have been the room number my mother was in.
Okay.
But that really struck me. That was like
I don't think it would be a room number.
Yeah. So the rectification method had given me 9:04, and my father's handwriting under my name and date of birth, it said 9:05. And he obviously didn't remember all those years later why he wrote that, but that really struck me like there might be something to astrology.
Okay.
So that's the time I've used from my birth since then. 9:04, 9:05, I roughly rectified it. And it seems to work. So, but based on that chart, what I did is I followed my own chart. I followed the planetary movements by transit around the chart, and just to see what would happen. And the easiest thing to follow was the moon. So I followed the moon house by house, and it did seem to correlate with what I was doing on those days. So like if the moon was in the second house, I'd be paying a bill or buying something. And in the third house, I might go to the library. And this really struck me that there was something to the houses, the idea of houses. And the other thing I noticed that didn't make sense until I learned more about Hellenistic astrology years later was I noticed that when planets change signs, and I was using Placidus cusps at the time, so that the cusp was within the sign. So say Scorpio is the sign on my second house, Placidus cusp, maybe it's 10, 12 degrees. But as soon as a planet entered Scorpio, something seemed to happen related to the cusp that was in that sign. And this puzzled me because in quadrant house systems, the beginning of Scorpio would have been in my first house. So it should have been a first house event, but it was always a second house event, which is more consistent with the Jyotish position that the whole signs are the houses.
Yeah.
And only when I started learning about whole sign houses in the 70s and 80s did it dawn on me that what I was seeing in my own chart following planets entering signs and triggering the cusp within that sign was the whole sign house system.
Okay.
So anyway, so this was a hobby. Astrology has been a serious hobby. I never became a professional astrologer.
And you're talking about late teens and early 20s, after you actually found out your birth time from the attic, in a book or a notebook in an attic,
Yeah.
that in which your father had written the time, which had matched up almost just short by a
Within a minute,
minute.
yeah.
Yeah. So okay, let's just I just have a little political question here.
Sure.
So you were born just after, just 2 months after the World War was done. So I don't know how the world would have been, or what kind of impact, or what are some of the, did you face any, some kind of a social pressure or something that is unusual or tensed that is happening around during the childhood or late child, even in your teens, because Cold War was also very prominent during that time. So did normal people in USA have any kind of an impact, or it was just a normal period?
My recollection was the war had ended, and from what I observed, people were putting it behind them and starting their lives
Okay.
in a new period. When I was young, the most fearful thing, I think, was there was a polio epidemic. We're now in the coronavirus epidemic. There was I think it was worldwide, certainly in the United States, a polio epidemic. I assume it was worldwide. It was very scary. And until there was a vaccine for polio, there were kids I knew who got the disease and were paralyzed, had to be on what they called iron lung machines. And so that was a big fear among parents. And people were very relieved when the vaccine became available, I think in the early 50s, is my recollection. But that was a scary period for children. I remember that. And my parents being worried that I or my brothers could get polio. And there being people in the town I lived in, people I knew, classmates in school, who had gotten polio and couldn't come to school anymore. It was scary.
Oh, okay.
And I don't remember what year. I think it was early 50s is my recollection.
Okay. So, yeah.
That makes me think, I mentioned school. I went to Catholic schools as a youngster.
Okay.
And the nuns used to talk a little about astrology, that it was the work of the devil.
Okay.
And that you should avoid it. But they would say these curious things like, even if it's accurate, you shouldn't pay attention to it because it's the work of the devil. And that got me even more curious. Like, why is it forbidden? And if it's accurate, why shouldn't we learn about it? I mean, what's wrong with it? What are they afraid of? So that got me more curious.
Okay. So I think your prowess in primary directions or distributions, answers that you are pretty proficient in mathematics. So when did your love affair with mathematics start? I think it was the university level.
No, it started pretty young. I was really interested in all of the natural sciences, especially. So in addition to, I guess I was kind of a nerdy teenager. I would go out at night and look at the stars with my telescope. but I was also really interested in meteorology.
Oh,
And I read a lot about weather forecasting. So I guess I was interested in forecasting. And I found this really interesting book that had these tables of how to forecast the weather. And so, and again, I may be 12, 13, 14 years old now. And there were books for kids about you could construct your own barometer. You can construct your own hygrometer and so on. So I did that. And then I would keep logs of the changes in barometric pressure and humidity and wind direction and the types of clouds, cumulus, cirrus, et cetera, the direction they were flowing in, et cetera.
okay.
And then I would look up in this book what that pattern represented and make a forecast. And I got pretty good at forecasting the weather, at least locally, within a few days. And it was pretty accurate. And then it occurred to me that I was interested somewhat in electronics, that I sort of built a primitive computer.
Okay.
So I had it was really primitive. I had a light bulb, like for rain, sunny, et cetera. And then I constructed a circuit with a battery so that depending on, you would flip a switch. There were a series of switches for what type of clouds they were, whether the pressure was rising or falling, what the humidity was doing, and then it would make a circuit that would light up one of the lights that gave the forecast.
Oh.
So it was like 11, 12 when I did this, 12, 13 maybe. And it was my first computer,
Okay.
my weather forecasting computer. It was pretty accurate.
That's great.
So I guess, and what fascinated me was the ability to take data, apply a theory, and come up with a prediction. I guess that's what we do in astrology, at least some types of astrology.
Sure.
And I used the same system, interestingly. I started using it to compose music. So instead of, what I did was I got a lot of children's songs, and I looked at the patterns of the notes, like Mary Had a Little Lamb, those kind of songs, and calculate the probability that if one note appeared, what note was most likely to appear after it, and what note was less second likely. And then I did a similar circuit and would compose little songs based on the probabilities of notes following one another in these sort of nursery rhyme songs.
I mean, I think the world missed a great scientist.
But this is how I amused myself. And the astrology fit into this. Like, if you have one thing and then something follows it, what's a likely consequence and what's a second likely consequence and so on.
Sure.
But anyway, that's how I was thinking in those days. And so to do this, I had to learn some math, and to do the astrology, I had to really learn to be proficient with logarithms and trigonometry and so on. So anyway, so I really liked math and science a lot. And when I went to university, I majored in mathematics and minored in physics.
Oh.
And
So I think this leads to the Vietnam War episode. And then finally, you took up psychiatry later on, right?
Yeah, that was a roundabout route, but yes.
Okay.
What happens, I began a doctoral program in mathematics right at the start of the Vietnam War.
Okay.
And I was opposed to the war. I was one of these young people opposed to the war. There was a large number of us.
Oh.
And I begun this doctoral program, and then the government decided they needed more bodies to go fight in the war. But you could get and I was really opposed to the war and opposed to fighting in the war, which I thought was an immoral war at the time.
Okay.
But the country was desperate for teachers, especially in the sciences. So I left my doctoral program and began teaching, basically to avoid going into the war.
Oh.
And I love teaching. I really enjoyed teaching. But I didn't want to be, I was teaching high school mathematics,
Okay.
algebra, and beginning calculus. Those were the courses, and trigonometry. And that was a period of a great deal of reflection, because it occurred to me that if I couldn't, because of the circumstances, complete the doctorate, because it was really, you really had to work full time in the doctoral program to do it. If I had to be teaching full time, what I liked about teaching was interaction with the students.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine who was also a graduate student with me was sort of in a similar dilemma, and he decided to go to medical school.
Oh.
And to me, that seemed like an impossible dream, but he said, no, if you want to, you can do it. I mean, you just have to put your mind to it. And I think that conversation with my friend, medical school seemed to me to be a solution to my dilemma, that it would enable me to work with people, but in a different manner than teaching high school mathematics the rest of my life, which I didn't want to do.
Okay.
And to do something worthwhile. And that would make use of my interest in science.
Mm.
So while I was teaching, I began, because I hadn't done pre-med, I began taking courses at a local college to make up the prerequisites I hadn't taken. And then I applied to medical school and was accepted.
Okay.
And then in medical school, I really loved medicine. It was just wonderfully scientific and at the same time helpful to people. And the parts of medicine I liked, actually, you had to eventually choose a specialty.
Okay.
And the three areas I liked the best were internal medicine, because it was really a puzzle. You had to get all these symptoms and understand how the body worked internally and try to put the symptomatic picture with what you knew about the body's physiology and biochemistry, and come up with a diagnosis that put everything together in a neat sort of understanding of what was going on. And so that was very appealing. And then I love surgery, interestingly. I didn't think I would, but I think what I liked about surgery was it was very precise and clean cut. You would identify a problem, you'd have a solution, you'd meticulously take care of it, and the person will get better. And it was very hands-on. And then I loved psychiatry, because it had to do with the mind, and there was so much new information that we were learning scientifically about the brain and how it functions, and neurotransmitters and circuits in the brain, and the whole idea of mind, body, or whatever, that philosophically that had always fascinated me. What is mind, and how is mind separate from body, or are they just different manifestations of the same thing, or is the world dualistic, or is it idealistic or materialistic? Just all these philosophical questions. And I finally opted on psychiatry because it seemed the most broad-based and open-ended and fascinating.
Okay.
Because there was so much that we were learning about. I think I went to medical school in the 1970s. It's in the past 50 years, we've probably learned more about the brain and how it functions than in the previous 2,000 or 3,000 years. It's been really amazing. And I should say, in university, philosophy always fascinated me. Just the whole idea of thinking about ideas and seeing how they developed and different implications of ideas and how they fit together or contradict each other, which is part of what I like about astrology too. And I'm digressing here, but when I started learning about Hellenistic astrology, I was really impressed with how, particularly the ideas of Socrates and Plato, fit the Hellenistic model. I don't know if this is written about so much, but it just seems there's so many parallels between Plato's ideas and how the Hellenistic astrologers put their astrology together. But anyway, so that's where we, so medical school. And, astrology has continued as a hobby. There were periods in my life I was so busy studying, practicing medicine or psychiatry, having a family, there just wasn't time to do much astrology. But it's something I've always returned to as a serious interest.
So you were also married while you were at the university, or?
No, I got married. I was 32, so I'd finished medical school. Okay. Actually, my wife and I met. We were both in a training program in a hospital. Oh. She's a psychologist, so that's Great. How we met. And
so there is always mind games.
Right. And then, once you have children, there's very little time left, as you know.
Yeah.
If you have a family, a career, and I would find time for astrology when I could, but it wasn't always easy.
Okay. So what are some of the earliest works that you were banking on? Because those days, as you already mentioned, there were very less amount of literature that was available for people to find out and learn or read astrology. But I think you would have become far more attached, or you would have started studying or doing astrology far more towards the late 60s or the early 70s probably. So what were some of the materials that you were banking on at that particular point of time, and what led you to traditional astrology? So because James Holden's paper is most widely considered as a path-breaking definitive moment in terms of reviving some of the earliest materials of astrology. But I think James Holden had also translated some of the works earlier which he had not published by then. So, but I think you would have.
Do you remember what year James published? I don't remember.
I think 1984 it was Holstein Houses.
No, there was an interest in traditional astrology prior to James publishing in 84. I mean, that led up to his publishing, obviously. But I'm trying to answer your question. Let me think for a second.
Okay.
So the earliest things I read were in the local library, which had maybe 4 books.
Okay.
Evangeline Adams and maybe Grant Louis and I can't remember the author, but anyway, they weren't really traditional. But Evangeline Adams, she had one of her ghostwriters was Aleister Crowley, who was pretty well versed in astrology, and she was in the American kind of Alan Leo school, so that there had been an interest with Alan Leo in reviving astrology, and that group had access to William Lilly. Mm-hmm. But it was William Lilly in the form of an abridged version. that came out about 1850.
Okay.
I think Zadkiel was supposedly the editor of this. And it was basically his book on horary astrology that had been abridged and published about 1850 that was still in print. And I remember getting a copy of it when I must have been in my early 20s, because I was visiting a friend in Boston, and we went into a bookstore that had an astrology section, and I found this book by William Lilly. So this would have been, let's see, 45, 65, late 60s, I'd say.
Okay.
I got my first copy of Lilly.
Great.
And I tried to read it, and it didn't make any sense. It was just, and it was, I remember there was this publisher called Dover Books, Dover, and they would take books that were out of print and out of copyright and republish them. And so they had found this book from the 1850s by William Lilly, his abridged version, and published it. And, and I read through it, and I mean, some of it made sense, a lot of it didn't, but it was clear that he was doing horary astrology. And it just seemed that it was overwhelming. There's so many rules and exceptions, and that I didn't get into it at the time. But I was curious about horary astrology because I'd had an experience with it. When I was little, little teens. So there's very little in the library, but there was a magazine that was published and pretty widely distributed in the United States called Horoscope, Dell Horoscope Magazine. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yeah.
And I think they might even still be publishing today.
I think they retired in the March of 2020.
Oh, okay. And so periodically I would, if we were in the supermarket, I would get a copy of it. And it had interesting articles about astrology. And I remember once they would have these advertisements in the back, and there was a little blurb. Some astrologer in Brooklyn, New York was teaching a class on horary astrology. And he was asking people to write in questions. And if your question was chosen, his class would answer it and give you the response.
Oh.
So I thought, this is interesting. I'll try it. What do I have to lose? So I wrote a letter, and I was in high school, I think, probably entering my senior year of high school. And I remember this because my question was, in a year I'd be going to university. My family didn't have a lot of money.
Okay.
And so unless I got scholarships, I wouldn't be able to afford the university. And I'd applied for a scholarship, I think, over the summer between my junior and senior year. And my question was, will I get this scholarship? I mean, I applied for several, but there was a particular one I wanted to get. So I wrote in, and maybe a month later, or a month or two later, it took a long time, I got a response back, and it was my original letter, and at the bottom it just said no. No explanation. But they answered my question, and they were right.
Okay.
I didn't get that scholarship. And then I started thinking, the scientific part of me said, well, they could have flipped the coin and come up with, no, it's 50-50. So, and they didn't say what they were thinking. So who knows if there's anything to this horary stuff or not.
Okay.
That was my first experience with horary. They got the right answer. I don't know how they did, or they didn't send back a chart or anything. It was just a no. But that got me interested in William Lilly more. Oh, and there was another thing I remember reading. There was a book in high school. Again, I was reading in the sciences and the scientific method, and there were a couple of books I read that I really enjoyed. One was called Science is a Sacred Cow. It was very popular back then. And it looked at science and it's the uses of abuses of the scientific method. And I think a theme of the book was, we all trust science, but maybe too much, because scientists have their biases. It can be misused, and you really have to understand what it can and cannot do, basically. And then there was another book about scientific method, because I was trying to understand what this Science of the Sacred Cow guy was talking about. And I don't remember the author of that book, but it was this extensive look, more philosophical, at the scientific method. And he gave an anecdote. So I think he was a British author, because this, and the anecdote may or may not have happened, but it went like this. There's a group of British astronomy students, and they're spending the weekend at an observatory in England. And it's really boring. And it's the nighttime, and there's a knock on the door, and there's a woman from the local village who's pretty uneducated. And she comes to them and says, I need help. I lost, I don't know, my wedding ring, and you're astronomers. Can you tell me how to find it? Because she didn't know the difference between astronomers and astrologers. And in this observatory, there happens to be a copy of William Lilly. Okay. So these college students, as a joke, just get out William Lilly and read his instructions and do her chart and tell her to go home and look here and look under this, and it's in a place with something red, etc. And the next day, the woman comes back, and they think, oh, she's going to be screaming at us for pulling her leg. And they open the door, and she's, I can't thank you enough. You found my ring. So that story struck with me, that these astronomy students thought they were playing a joke on her, and the joke turned out to be on them, because they did what William Lilly said, and she found her ring. So that story was at the back of my mind from my high school days. And finally, in the 1980s, the Regulus edition of Lilly came out. So there was now a full unabridged version of Lilly, which I ordered a copy from England and got, and read it very carefully. Okay. And began doing horary based on, and at this point I was understanding Lilly a little better, because I had learned other stuff. But anyway, yeah, I was also fortunate. I began attending in Connecticut, where I live. There is and has been a very active and very good astrology society. Okay. That has monthly meetings. And so back in the 80s, we'd have a monthly lecture, sometimes a workshop, and occasionally they'd sponsor a weekend conference. We had really good speakers, so I would go to those as faithfully as I could in the 80s and 90s. And I've gone less frequently in this decade, partly because of time constraints and aging and all that stuff.
Yeah, sure.
But we had some really, really good speakers. Rob Hand lived in the neighboring state, and he would frequently come and lecture, and he was wonderful.
Okay.
Bruce Schofield also lived in the neighboring state, maybe an hour away or hour and a half away. So he would come lecture, and he was brilliant, just excellent astrologer. And then there would be national people who came in. And so I learned a lot attending these lectures. I would take notes and talk to the people afterwards. And so that was a good source of learning. And I would occasionally do workshops if they were interests of mine and so on.
Okay.
So anyway, we're sort of lost track of where we are now.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So, so after this, your acquaintance with William Lilly's horary astrology, and you might have gone through the 80s without having much of traditional astrology material unless and until you were exposed to James Holden's work by then. But I'm not sure when James Holden started publishing Maureen's work. I really don't know the date, but I think you were associated with James Holden in translating one of the
Yeah,
Spanish.
I don't remember the date. James got interested in Marinus, I think fairly early on. There was a guy I never met him, Zoltan Mason,
Okay.
used to teach Marinus. He had a bookstore in New York, and he would teach Marinus. I never met him, and I never went to his bookstore, unfortunately. But many astrologers who got into Marinus had studied with Zoltan Mason. And in the late 80s, early 90s, I don't remember the exact year, I met Luis Lesueur from Mexico. He's deceased now. And he and I became friends and corresponded a lot. And he had actually come from Mexico to spend time in New York City studying with Zoltan Mason.
Oh.
And would tell me about it. And so I decided I had to, partly because of Luis, that I had to learn Marinus, because he seemed to be, Luis praised the Marinus system. And what he liked about it was that it was a very logical, orderly, scientific method. And then, I forget what year it was probably in the late 90s, Robert Corey, who had been a student of Zoltan Mason, began offering a course on Marinus from what he'd learned from Zoltan Mason. And so it was a correspondence course which I took. And that's how I met Robert Corey. And then I had studied Latin in high school. And I had, because I was working in a clinic that had a lot of Spanish-speaking clients, patients, I had begun to learn Spanish because of my work as a psychiatrist to talk to my patients.
Oh.
And so Robert learned that I could read Latin and Spanish, and he was very involved with James Holden in trying to get all of Marinus published. So he asked me if I would translate book 18 of Astrological Gallica. I think there's 26 books or something. James had translated a great number of them. The most important book is 21, I think, is the Marinus Method itself of Determinations. And there are two translations of that. One is Lucy Little, whom Zoltan Mason asked to translate. And the other is James Baldwin, which I think is a better translation than Lucy Little's.
Okay.
Or I think it's more readable. They both have some problems, but well, that's another thing.
Okay.
Because Marinus can be difficult at times, or there's some passages that don't make sense. And anyway, so at Robert's request, there's an astrologer in Spain who's quite fluent in Latin, Pepa Sanchez. And she had translated some Marinus, and she had done a translation of book 18, which was not in English, from Latin into Spanish. And so I corresponded with her, and she sent me a copy of her Spanish translation. And then working with James and the Spanish translation of Pepa, and I'd gotten a photocopy of the Latin text of Marinus. I did a translation of book 18.
Oh, great.
And which I would translate using Pepa's Spanish, Marinus's Latin, that I'd send it to James and he'd read it over and say, looks good. And I'd go to the next chapter. And that's how that was done. And So that, I think, finally got published in 2004.
So
And it's
how long did it actually take for you to translate that book?
At least a year, maybe more than a year, because I would do this in the evening after I had gotten home from work and
Okay.
spent time with my family and so on.
Okay.
It was a big project.
Yeah,
Because it involved translating. I would read it in the Latin, look at it I would read it in the Spanish, compare it with the Latin, try to put it into English. And then once I had a chapter done, I'd send it to James, who would send me feedback, because I wanted to be sure my Latin is so-so, it's not great. James is quite fluent, and Pape is quite fluent.
Okay.
So that's how that got done. And it was interesting. What's interesting about translating, and it probably took maybe more than like a year and a half, 2 years, now that I think about it, because it was a big project. It's not that big a book, but just the Latin is not so easy, is if you translate from another language, eventually you get to see how the person's mind is working. So I really got a good glimpse into how Marinus thought about things. Because you could read a sentence and then you'd know, oh, so I think he's going here with this idea. And then you'd follow it. And yeah, that's where he went. And repeatedly, he would use the same sort of argumentation.
Okay.
So you get a sense of, well, this is how he thinks about things.
Sure.
And
that's quite fascinating.
yeah.
But even before that, you had published some of your books. So which one was your first book as it is? I think it was Soul Returns.
The first book was a horror.
Okay, yeah, for which you actually was awarded the Regalist in York.
It was what happened was, in the 80s, I was really into horror. I was reading Lilly, doing a lot of charts, corresponding with a lot of people. I was involved with a group that published a journal called the Horary Practitioner. And there was a group of people who contributed to it. The main person who responsible is Carol Wiggers, but there was a group of several others of us who corresponded with each other and with Carol and would submit charts and articles. And this journal came out, I don't know, for 2 or 3 years and then it stopped. It was very good. It reviewed Lilly's techniques with sample charts, both from his book and then contemporary charts that we'd all been working on. So I learned a lot from that group, working with that group and writing for that journal and reading what other people wrote and so on.
Okay.
And during this time, as I was learning, I was taking notes, and then a friend of mine suggested, well, you have all these notes, why don't you put them in book form? So I did. And that's how the horror book got written. And then that book became very popular in the late 80s. It came out, I think, the very end of the 80s or 1990. And then at the 1992 UAC conference was it in Washington or Baltimore? I can't remember exactly where it was. To my surprise, when they gave Regulus Awards, there was an award called Most Promising Newcomer Regulus Award. So I won that for this book. It was totally unexpected. And it wasn't the big Regulus Award that people get for major contributions, but it was a little one that sort of recognized the book as a contribution to the field. So I was pleased about that.
Sure, that's great.
Yeah. And then during this period, I was never into tarot before Horary, but doing Horary, a number of people I met were also tarot readers. I guess because they like divination. And so at the encouragement of people that I met, or curiosity, I started learning tarot. And the books available in those days were I didn't like. They were much too new agey or
Okay.
esoteric and to stuff I wasn't into. And it seemed to me you didn't have to be a master at metaphysics to be able to read a tarot card.
Okay.
So, so I basically began doing the same thing I'd done with the Hori book. I was taking notes, doing a lot of readings, and basically taking notes on my readings to see how the cards played out or what the symbolism meant. And I put this in book form. And that book's been very popular. It's Tarot Plain and Simple. Basically, it's kind of a catalog of my journey through the cards and letting them teach me what they mean instead of trying to piece together a metaphysical system to explain them.
Sure. And you had also written this solar returns, art of forecasting through solar returns.
Yeah. The interesting history of that is, actually, I think I remember talking to Luis Lesur in Mexico, and this is back around early 90s. And he had said to me, he used solar returns, and sometimes were very accurate, and sometimes they had nothing to do with the year ahead.
Okay.
And that puzzled me because they were a major predictive technique in the history of astrology. And Bruce Schofield, who I'm very friendly with, and we would get together at conferences and so on, I asked him about this, and he said, this also was the early 90s. I've had the same experience. Sometimes they seem very accurate and sometimes totally irrelevant. And so these are two people who I really respected as astrologers, who were saying that solar returns were sometimes really effective and sometimes totally off base. And I knew historically they were a key predictive technique, and that bothered me. It seemed like something wrong here. Maybe we're not looking at them correctly. And so when I got into Marinus, I read his book on solar returns, and like it opened up the light. He made it clear that, well, the contemporary books on solar returns in English at the time, so late 80s, early 90s, looked at it as a standalone chart, as if it existed without reference to the birth chart.
Okay.
And Marinus made very clear, no, you have to start with the birth chart. If it's not in the birth chart, then it's not going to happen. And the solar return acts more like a trigger to how the birth chart will manifest in that particular year. So instead of seeing the solar return as something independent that you could predict from, you use the solar return as a lens with which to look at the birth chart to see what will be highlighted that year by the solar return. And then using that technique, it suddenly all made sense and it became a very powerful technique. Now, what Marinus had done was he got rid of what he considered superstitious aspects of solar return interpretation. So he got rid of perfections, that were just nonsense terms, things that after doing that book, I came to learn and appreciate. At first I kind of agreed with Marinus, they do seem silly and they can't possibly work. And they do seem very superstitious, so let's not even bother. But when I started looking at those older techniques, more superstitious techniques, more carefully, they did seem to work. So my view on solar returns has changed. I still think Marinus is quite accurate, but should be supplemented with the stuff he threw out.
Okay.
I think he threw out good material, good predictive techniques.
Sure. So, and later on, I think you also published a small ebook on primary directions, which has been extremely helpful for me to learn the technique.
Yeah, primary directions. I always found primary directions hard to understand. the concept is very simple.
Okay.
After birth, the sky keeps moving. And if you see how the sky in the hours after birth corresponds to your birth chart, you can make predictions. But the math of that was always puzzling to me. And so I put that book together really to explain to myself the mathematical concepts that underlie it.
Sure.
Okay, so the math of primary directions, it's pretty straightforward to know when a planet will reach the midheaven or the ascendant. So that's not too confusing. What's confusing mathematically, potentially confusing, is if you have planets in between the midheaven or the meridian and the horizon. How do you tell when one will align with another? And there's different methods. Marinus used the Regiomontanus method, and Placidus felt that his method was more true to what Ptolemy wrote in the Tetrabiblos. Let's leave it at that, because it will get too complicated. And so that's what I was trying to understand.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've kind of, when I started doing primary directions, I used to have Ganston's book and your book, which is an ebook. So I used to kind of, run through here and there and see from there what I can take. So it was extremely
Martin
helpful.
Ganston's book is excellent. He really systematically goes through step by step, and yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you've also presented in some of the astrology conferences, right?
Yeah, over the years I've presented. I think actually when I first met Luis, he invited me to Mexico to do a workshop on horary, and I've been in Mexico a few times doing various workshops and lectures. Most recently, last year, I was in Spain. There's an, I forget what it's called, the Iberic Astrology Conference. That's probably not the correct name.
Okay.
And I presented on solar returns there.
Okay.
And interestingly, in preparing that talk, it was from the point of view more of the Persian approach. But I kept finding examples in which dramatic changes in a person's life, the solar return almost always had the true nodes making a station, or about to make a station, or having just made a station. So either being very slow or being stationary at the time of the solar return. And that was so consistent that was one of the things I was surprised to find that I presented at the conference, that if you do your solar return, use the true lunar nodes, not the mean nodes, because they're always regressing. Years in which they're stationary on your return are usually dramatic years where there's lots of changes in your life, and sometimes disruptive changes.
Oh, okay. So, but anyway, you published your solar returns book long back, and after that,
the solar returns book is really based on going through Marinus and reviewing the literature, but I didn't have access at that time to the Persian stuff.
Yeah, probably not even Valence and Dorotheus. I mean, from the time that you have published your book on solar returns, and now you have consumed a lot of materials, I mean, ancient and medieval materials on solar returns.
So if I were doing it again, I would amend it to include perfections and Lord of the Orb and things like that I think are important.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers entire, your astrological career. So what lies ahead?
Well, I still regard myself as a student, so I'm trying to learn.
Sure.
There was something that came up recently. You and I were talking about uh, Ptolemy's method of predicting lifespan
Yeah.
and the issue of the prenatal lunation came up.
Yes.
And this really puzzled me because most of the authors I'd read had used the newer full moon immediately preceding the birth, whereas Ptolemy in that technique, as you pointed out, used for date charts, the full moon, even if there was a new moon preceding the birth, even if there was a full moon in between.
Yeah.
And that really puzzled me, because most other authors don't do it Ptolemy's way. And so what was Ptolemy thinking? And Ptolemy really wasn't an astrologer as far as we know. He's more of a natural scientist who was writing an encyclopedia. So is this unique to Ptolemy? Did he just make it up because it fit with his science? Or was there really some astrological technique he was using that we're not familiar with, that no other astrologers were using at the time?
Oh.
So these things puzzle me.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Birchfield compiled, all the historical data
Right.
as far as prenatal lunations are concerned, which is extremely, brilliant stuff. Because I just asked him a night before, like when
Yeah.
we were talking, and he had
I
compiled.
read his article. It's very helpful, and but it still leaves me puzzled.
Yeah, because as far as the technique goes, we have to find out what works and what does not. So, really, or maybe we are yet to find out the actual material which says the truth or logic of whatever, if Ptolemy was right or whosoever was right. So,
yeah,
still,
but I think the point of that example is that I'm always learning something new, and I'm always
yeah.
realizing that I didn't really understand the basic stuff to begin with.
And there is always a check somewhere.
Right,
Uh,
but I think that, and this is in any field, not just astrology, it's always useful to go back to basics because we really don't understand the basics as well as we think we do.
sure.
Because, and partly, I think philosophically, that's because the basics of our field, any field, have an underlying foundation of some sort of presupposition about the universe that we take for granted without thinking or examining. And that if we keep going back to basics and trying to understand the basics, eventually we realize there's a layer underneath that we've never even thought about or looked at, and that has to do with some assumption we're making that we're not even aware that we're making,
Yeah,
that
sure.
determines how we see things. And it's trying to unearth those assumptions. Like here's an example. I was just thinking about this yesterday. Levy had asked me to talk with him about this technique that's in Paulus about the indicator of profession, a
Uh-huh.
Hellenistic technique. And in Paulus's method, which is I think standard Hellenistic method, he talks about the planets of action, the planets that determine our action in the world being Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Those are the three planets that if you study a chart, you study to see the vocation of the person. What will that person do in this life?
Hmm.
And I was thinking about that, and it occurred to me that, well, that's a description of Plato's conception of the human soul. There's the chariot with the two horses, and the guy who rides the chariot is the rational mind, Mercury, and the two horses are desire, Venus, and courage or boldness, Mars. And so there's the Platonic soul that becomes a Hellenistic technique in terms of the planets, but it goes back to Plato's dialogue about what is the nature of the human soul. You have the rational mind trying to steer desire and boldness, the Venus and the Mars, on a good course in life. which is what the action planets do.
Sure, yeah.
So,
Yes. I mean, it makes sense, yeah.
yeah.
So, and we cannot close the show unless and until we talk about your blog, which is extremely prolific, and you've been doing it for more number of years now. So I think it is
The
also one of the
blog
good
grew out of,
sources. I mean, I just meant to say that it is one of the very good sources, to come and read astrology. I mean, come and read standard and quality astrology. So,
well, the blog is my thinking out loud about things I'm thinking about at the time. Unfortunately, I live in a little state, in a small town, in a little state of Connecticut. There aren't many astrologers around, and there are very, very few astrologers interested in the same topics I'm interested in.
okay.
So I have no one to talk to about this stuff. So I put it in the blog. And those are my musings. I mean, there's probably stuff there that's inaccurate or that I wouldn't say again years later, but it's how I was thinking at the time and trying to piece it together.
I mean, I think everyone does the same with the blog. So that's what, but we change our perceptions about that particular thing that we wrote years ago later on, as and when we kind of get acquired with new texts or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So I always enjoyed your blog because whenever, especially with regards to triplicity lords or primary directions or something, or horary astrology, invariably the search results kind of puts your blog in first 2, 3, 4, or probably even the entire page when it comes to horary. So,
I'm still trying to figure horror out.
okay.
It can be very confusing, I think, at times. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you have anything to mention as it is?
No, I do this for fun. I'm a perpetual student and I keep learning.
Cool. So, I think that pretty much brings us towards the end, and I'm sure people will enjoy. Thank you so much for joining.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for doing these videos and for your work. Yeah.
Thanks.